I think if you were to take a look at the computer science standards, you'd quickly recognize that they're bigger than just coding. They're bigger than just learning how to make program in language XYZ. In fact, I connect it usually to probably the leading buzzword that an employer puts on a job posting. They're looking for critical thinkers, right? And I think computer science brings a set of tools and perspectives that let students become better critical thinkers.
I'm Nikki Herda, and this is Bright, Stories of Hope and Innovation in Michigan Classrooms, a podcast where we celebrate our state's educators and explore the future of learning. Bright is brought to you in part by Mimic Insurance Company, ensuring the educational community for more than 70 years. Teachers and school employees visit mimic.com/quote to see how much you can save. In today's episode of Bright, I chat with Kevin Santer, a lead instructor for Michigan Virtual's Career and Technical Education online courses. Kevin was honored as our 2019 Online Teacher of the Year and recently served on a statewide committee to help update Michigan's K-12 computer science standards. Kevin shares his journey in leaving a 20-year career in software development to become a teacher, uses the lens of computer science to explore what it means to think and ultimately to be human, and offers 3 ways to bring computer science concepts into the classroom. Well, Kevin, it's great to have you on the Bright podcast today. Thank you for joining me.
Well, I'm glad to be here, Nikki. Thanks for thinking of me.
Of course, yeah. So we're starting off season 3 asking everybody the same question, which is, what is the most interesting thing that you're doing in your classroom right now?
There's a few things to choose from. One of the things that I'm very excited about is in my computer science principles course. It's an AP course, but it's designed kind of more for the non-technical person. So rather than like deep into programming, it's to give them a broad view of the field. And something they're looking at right now is big data and big data analysis and the ethical concerns that might come with it. And it's really cool to see young people, being articulate and arguing passionately over something that is really kind of geeky underneath the hood. So I'm liking seeing that a lot.
That sounds really interesting. So do you tend to attract students who might, not have a ton of computer expertise or like coding experience? And do you get to see those lights turn on as they kind of realize the power?
Yes, I was a little surprised. So I think this is my 3rd year teaching this course. We just kind of revamped it for this year. And we get a mix. Like there's probably, I'm going to say 60% of students are like the ones you describe, who are just kind of, looking to broaden their horizons and, getting those first exposures. And the others are often very deeply knowledgeable about it. They know tons of coding, they know lots of these things, and they can bring lots of, strong opinions and a lot of detailed information to the mix. So it's an unusual mix, I think, of the inexperienced and the very deeply experienced.
Very cool. That sounds like a really awesome course. All right, we're going to change gears a little bit, and I'm going to have you tell me about a time when you just vividly remember falling in love with teaching. So that could be, before you were in education, or it could have been something that happened while you were in education that reaffirmed that love for you.
Yeah, and kind of to that latter point, there are moments all the time, if I take the time to recognize them, like what you described, where it kind of reinforces why you're in it and gives you that, nudge to go on. There were a couple of early ones. So I worked in software development for about 20 years before coming to teaching. And I had the opportunity when working at a large automotive company to become involved in their Six Sigma program, which is about quality control and process management and stuff like that. And, went through training and became actually an educator for that program within the company. And that was really my first semi-formal taste of teaching. And it was really exciting, to kind of recognize that I like doing this and to feel like, I think I could be kind of good at this. That was maybe my first like adult reflection on what it might be like to be a teacher.
So it started with adults for you.
Yeah. I have a long history of educators in my family. I think you've probably heard me tell this story. But I counted up at one time and it was like 28 or something like that if I count, grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins, who are some form of teacher. So of course, I was just surrounded by growing up and heard the perspective, even as a little guy, of what it's like to be a teacher. So I don't think there were too many like light bulb moments. It was more like a slow immersion in it. And that's the way it went for me. But yeah, it was as an adult where I think, I first considered, I really might give this a go.
Did you start teaching online, or did you start teaching face-to-face?
No, I taught about 10 years in the face-to-face classroom.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how did that, I guess, once you got into the classroom, what did you realize that you loved about it?
I hadn't anticipated really how deeply connected I would get to some students. We always talk about relationship building, and I'm not like an unempathetic robot, but I was really floored by, what a difference that would make. And even when students would articulate, in whatever stumbling form a 16 or 17-year-old might be able to, the difference that I had made was really that tangible, right there in your face validation and feedback of what you're doing is very different from when you get in a large corporate world, right? No matter how positive your yearly review is, it's nothing like those honest moments or the goofy ones, right? I got to be, a dorky math teacher and basically tell tell dad jokes and get kids to laugh at them. You could get a kick out of it. So I think there were unexpected rewards along with the expected ones. And, don't get me wrong, just how exasperating they can be at times, but that's part of it too. Day in and day out that you had some impact. Maybe not always good, right? But that you did something that day.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's great. And can you tell me a little bit about your journey into education? Because you did have an interesting one.
As an undergraduate, I studied computer science and worked in that industry for about 20 years. Got the chance to work for, it was kind of cool, a number of different size companies, kind of from quite small to medium to large. So I got a real good perspective on, what that business looks like. Worked in a lot of different application fields, from finance to quality control, et cetera, et cetera. And at some point, I, started thinking, okay, well, is this really, what I want to do for the rest of my life? Not that I was unhappy in any way, but, there's only so many windows that open after a while. So I, shared the experience about my chance to teach a little bit in that role. And just, with the very brave and generous support of my wife and family, decided to chuck that career, go back to school. And I originally was a math teacher in the face-to-face classroom because they didn't offer any computer science courses, and was lucky to be able to develop, at least the starting of that curriculum. So by the time I'd left, we had, a fledgling little computer science program going. And when I reached the point where, again, looking for something new after about 10 years, that I was hoping to be able to kind of marry the two backgrounds in a certain way, to be able to leverage more of my experience in software development, in understanding computer systems, and being able to, the systems thinking training I had, to be able to kind of merge that a little bit more, or leverage that side a little bit more.
Well, and I've heard, really cool things about, your contributions to as an online teacher, because you have that, software background, that you've helped, build little Google extensions and different sorts of things to make online teaching easier.
I think that background helped me a lot going into the face-to-face classroom, or going into teaching in the first place. Rather than facing what I think I hear a lot of young instructors express, where, they're like, I went into teaching because I really wanted to, but I've always wondered, should I have, been a writer? Should I have gone into, and I was lucky enough to have really 2 full careers beforehand and walk into this, eyes wide open, head held up, and be able to bring all that experience. So I think I was able to bring a lot of credibility when I talked about real world examples. I was able to know that I was doing what I chose to do, and both those things together were a big leg up for me as a beginning teacher.
Yeah, that's really cool. I really like that story. Thank you. So today we're going to be talking about 3 ways to bring computer science concepts into your classroom. I'm wondering if first we can pause to unpack the why a little bit. So I know that you've done a lot of work at the state level to form the computer science standards. And I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about this work and why it's so important, and this is indicated in those state standards, that all students have exposure to some fundamental computer science concepts.
Yeah. It was a really cool opportunity to be involved in working on those state standards, not just because it's valuable work and I got to meet interesting people, but to force me to articulate to myself what I thought was important. Are all my pearls of wisdom in the final standards? Of course not. But, it was a time to reflect a little bit. First, I'm going to take, I think, kind of the lazy answer to bring computer science concepts into your classroom. I'm going to argue that they're there already, right? And that it's more about recognizing them, articulating them, and reinforcing them, right? We don't think about, well, how am I going to bring reading into my classroom? I mean, we do, but we know it's there, right? Even in a math classroom, we know reading's already there. It's a matter of bringing a focus to it and, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it isn't a stretch to say that the same thing's going on for computer science. Of course, there's all the hard technical skills. Every list of top jobs for the next X years is going to list computer programming and stuff like that. But by no means is every kid going to go into that. I heaven forbid they would. That just seems brutal and boring. I think if you were to take a look at the computer science standards, you'd quickly recognize that they're bigger than just coding. They're bigger than just learning how to make program in language XYZ. In fact, I connect it usually to probably the leading buzzword that an employer puts on a job posting. They're looking for critical thinkers, right? And I think computer science brings a set of tools and perspectives that let students become better critical thinkers. So that's my short answer to that. It's a sore point for me, the perspective that why do we need to add yet another thing? And I know you're not implying that, but so forgive me if I babble a little bit about that.
No, I like to ask questions that make people just a tiny bit peeved, because that's where you get the passionate and interesting answers. So that was spot on. So thank you. You were talking about how, every job description nowadays talks about critical thinking. It's something that we hear about whenever schools are putting out their, portrait of a graduate or whatever it might be. It's those critical thinking skills. And I was just wondering, as somebody who might not have a deep understanding of what these computer science concepts are that we're talking about, could you just expand on that a little bit about how these things facilitate critical thinking?
Yeah. So one of the things that's been put forward in computer science education thinking in the past 10, 15 years is this idea of computational thinking. So in addition to the more formal computer science theory and the hard techy, coding skills, there's this other, I don't know if you can see my hands right now, but I'm making a little Venn diagram with them to show the overlap. And there's this other region that is a more broader computational thinking. And it's described many different ways with varying levels of academic rigor. The 4 pieces that I like to hold on to, the 4 skills or approaches, the first one is called decomposition or functional decomposition, and it's divide and conquer, right? The ability to look at a large problem and break it down into smaller pieces, to look at a system, to break it into its component pieces. The next is pattern recognition, being able to identify, is this really a pattern? You know what? I think this has happened again and again. I wonder if we're looking at a pattern. The idea of abstraction, to say, well, it looks like this happens when I do that, and when I do it again over here, it happens again. Is there an underlying principle that I can abstract? What is it that a terrier and a poodle and a shepherd have in common that make them a dog, right? And this is a big part of something that kind of happened organically in the development of programming that we've recognized as kind of a philosophical underpinning. And the final one is the idea of algorithms, which I think most people are exposed to at this point. The idea that you communicate a process, the steps for a process, in crisp, clear-cut terms, that can be executed and reproduced by a computer or another person or something like that. So I think those four skills, when combined, especially I think the interplay between abstracting and decomposition, the kind of forest and trees back and forth that's necessary for deep understanding, I think, to me, go a long way towards defining what critical thinking is.
I just had a little epiphany over here, and
good. See?
It's one that you've probably already had, but since I'm, hadn't thought about these concepts in this way before, I was like, whoa. So this is based on a pretty limited understanding of how computers function, but the whole idea of computers, right, is you're teaching a machine how to think, sort of, right, especially with like AI and whatnot. So it does kind of make sense that in order to create a computer, you'd have to figure out what it is to actually, think critically. And so if humans can take those concepts and replicate them, they're also improving their own thinking. So I was like, oh my gosh, there are machines that think. That's so cool.
I think absolutely. And, the deeper philosophical waters, what does it mean to think? How will we know when a computer is thinking? And that leads to, not just this abstract sci-fi topic, but what does it mean for humans to think? What's going on with various psychological processes? What happens to someone when they're stricken with Alzheimer's and they slowly lose, what makes them them? There's deep waters that you can quickly connect to, and it's a lens like so many others.
Yeah, and if this is maybe a separate discipline, but if computers can think in some ways better than we can, what is it that makes us different, or what is it that makes us human? So yeah, there's some a deep heart there.
Philosophical questions. Yeah.
So one of the focuses of our conversation today is going to be about, bringing computer science concepts into your classroom. And so that, to me, begs the question, why is it that computer science should be cross-disciplinary? What does that bring to it?
Yeah, and I think I can play a similar trick to what I did with the last question and say that it already is cross-disciplinary, right? There is a small corner of computer science that is strictly about computer science and the theory of computer science, right? There is work that goes on there. But if you think about it, what do we use computers for? We use them for research. We use them in the hard sciences for, analysis. We use them in finance, at commerce. We use them in music. We use them in film. It's a set of tools already directed towards other disciplines, right? So I think in that sense, it is already cross-disciplinary.
I'm Nikki Herda, and you're listening to Bright, stories of hope and innovation in Michigan classrooms. Bright is brought to you in part by Mimic Insurance Company, ensuring the educational community for more than 70 years. Teachers and school employees visit mimic.com/quote to see how much you can save. Today, I'm chatting with Kevin Santer, a lead instructor for Michigan Virtual's career and technical education online courses, who left a 20-year career in software development to become a teacher. Up next, we dive into Kevin's top 3 suggestions for bringing computer science concepts into the classroom. I think it's time for us to dig in to your top 3 tips for bringing computer science concepts into the classroom. So can you kick us off with number 1?
Absolutely, I can. The first one, I think, is the idea of debugging. I've run across it in a lot of literature since the time this happened to me, but actually as a face-to-face math instructor, accidentally one day, student or a couple of students were working on a problem on the board and you could see they'd done it wrong. And I said, well, I think we're on the track here. We're on the right track here. Let's see if we can debug this. And I didn't even really think about it. It was just, years of being a programmer, that's just a common verb I have in my head. And one of them especially kind of looked at me like, side-eyed. But we got to the point and moved on. But it made me recognize, and then I consciously started using it, this idea of looking at problems as something to be debugged rather than the strict wrong, right. It was most painfully aware in the math classroom. You got the wrong answer. Done. Right? When, of course, we never want that, right? It's like, well, why did you get the wrong answer? And I think there's not just a liberating perspective there for a student, but I think there are some pragmatic avenues that open up with that perspective. Being able to dissect a problem, that decomposition idea, break it down. It looks good up to here, looks good up to here. Oh, this is where it goes wrong. This is where we need to focus our efforts. I mean, that's important. What is wrong with like my internal representation of this that I went awry here? I mean, I think there's a lot of power there. We talk about in students, constructing models in their head and representations and where they can fall short. Being able to know then when you actually have successfully debugged it. I'll, taught with my fellow math teachers about, students who will do a story problem about calculating a tip at dinner and they'll come up with, 28 cents or $3,512. You and I both immediately say, gosh, I think there might be something wrong with that. But we have to have a lot of context, right? This is these students had never been to a restaurant where they had to pay, certainly. Some of them maybe have never been to a restaurant where there was tipping involved, right? So the idea of how do I know when I get the right answer? How do I convince other people? I mean, I think those kinds of things really open up into social studies and English, the idea of convincing arguments and, being able to pose a counter argument and, skepticism and so forth. And I think I alluded to this before. When you do debugging, you often have to move back and forth between scales. You have to move between the forest and the trees. You have to look at, did I do, 4 sentences in this introductory paragraph versus, does this topic sentence even make sense to me, right? And I think students, grown-ups, aren't often adept at that kind of systems thinking of being able to hold the large picture in their mind at the same time as they're diving into the details. And I think those are all part of a debugging mindset. And especially when you frame it as, why doesn't it work yet? I think there's a lot of avenues.
I find it really fascinating. So I spoke with someone last season, Dr. Amin Yadav. Have you met him or heard of him before? Okay. And so he did talk a bit about debugging and
actually,
gave some examples.
He's a noted person on computational thinking.
Oh, so yes.
I'm grateful you see the connections.
Yes. And we talked a bit about, how in the math classroom specifically, using that as an example, and how that led to growth mindsets for students, right, in math classrooms.
Absolutely.
But I find it really interesting, the examples that you're telling me about, the English classroom, because that's kind of what I was just wondering too, is like, what would that look like in the English classroom? But I like the example that you gave, of like with the topic sentence, like, the topic sentence isn't working. What exactly is going on? And then like pulling back into that big picture and then zooming back in. I think that's a really neat way to think about it.
I think one of the places it shows up is in like peer reviewing stuff. Mm-hmm. In the coding world, we talk about pair programming, partner programming. One guy's at the keyboard and his partner is standing over his shoulder, and they take turns back and forth. And so there's this give and take of what they're focusing on, who is driving at that time. And I think the same kinds of things play out in the peer review papers and even in a well-run discussion, right? There, if there's a good Socratic guider from the outside, I think you can pull those things off. And I think you can pick apart at problems and look at, large and small scales.
That makes sense. All right. So that was number one. We've got, bringing in the concept of debugging. What have you got for us for your second strategy?
Rules, where they come from and when to break them. So, spoke about the idea of pattern recognition, of seeing when something is recurring and, abstracting that out and saying, you know what, this, I'm going to call this a hypothesis. I'm going to go so far as to call it a theory, right? So clearly we're already connected to the scientific method. But this happens, I'll use an English example. You're looking at meter and rhythm in poetry, right? And you can think about from as simple as a haiku up to a limerick, through iambic pentameter. There's these kind of rigid structures that we discovered people using, or I'm not enough of an expert to know where the chicken and egg is here. But at some point, people started recognizing, these poems all have this in common. What's going on with these? And so people started consciously using this as a set of rules, right? They recognized the pattern, they imitated it. And then, of course, the next stages are, well, what else can we do with that? What if I vary this by doing that? What if I all of a sudden have a poem that doesn't have words that rhyme? You can blow a third grader's mind with that. And I think this is something that computer science just has done since its inception, right? It's like you described, tackling something as grandiose as, what is human intelligence? Well, we're going to make our best stabs at modeling it, at describing the rules, if you will, the algorithms that we use. And then we're going to see where the boundaries of that are. What circumstances does it work in? What circumstances doesn't it work in? What are the limits of the rules? How much do they depend on the context they're in? Are we recognizing rules that were inherently there, or are we imposing some construct on there? Right? And it's easy to go from there again to more philosophical ideas like the rule of law and human nature, and fill in the blank with your thorny political social issue. I guess what I'm trying to do is connect the dots back to the critical thinker idea, that this awareness of and ability to recognize these patterns, to abstract and articulate these rules, to formulate and communicate algorithms, but also to be very aware of their limitations, right? My wife tells a story. She works in nursing informatics. She worked many years as a hospital nurse in intensive care units and stuff like that. But anyway, computerized prescription delivery system, right? The computer told the nurse that she should be giving 10 milligrams of this drug. Well, it turns out that the pills come in like 5 microgram doses. So 10 milligrams, I may be exaggerating the story, is like 40 pills or something like that. And fortunately, someone stepped in, but the poor person went so far as to dispense the 40 pills and was taking them to the patient before someone stepped in. And to me, it's a classic example of, well, the computer told me to, which is funny and horrific, but is something that I think happens all the time. Like I said, pick your social issue. Well, my parents always told me this, my society always told me this, or my English teacher always told me I should, have 5 paragraphs in a persuasive essay. Why wouldn't I do 6? So I don't want to overblow that, but I think the idea of formal systems, of identifying rules and algorithms, and playing around with them, knowing when you have to make the changes, when you have to adapt them.
So I'm very intrigued by what you're saying here. And I guess one question that I have is, so if I think about what this looks like in practice, I'm asking myself, and I can imagine you having these conversations with students, And I get the feeling maybe you do, but I could be wrong about that.
On my best day, right? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I could see the power of actually just talking like this with students, and getting them to think about what are rules and what does it mean to solve problems, and maybe using these computer science concepts as a framework and a way to say, oh, well, this is how it works in computing, and this is how we teach a computer how to do this thing, But just even getting it kind of pulls you out of your just default way of thinking, and it just pulls you back and makes you kind of stand above it and look down and be like, yeah, why do I listen to the computer? Where did this come from? What makes a rule? What makes, it's more philosophical and abstract than I would have thought. When I was thinking of this interview, even I was thinking, I don't know, more like you said, more like robotic.
I'm going to use a spreadsheet to look at economic data, right? And those are fabulous ideas, and of course students should be doing that. They shouldn't, But I do think there's an underlying depth, and that's where I'm attracted, right? I love having frameworks to hang things on. One of the reasons that I was not probably the most rewarding student in high school was that I passively rebelled when I didn't think something made sense, right? Or when someone couldn't explain to me, why this mattered to me. And so, I've probably done a bit of maturing since then, but I think that underlying, I really want to know what makes this hang together. Is a big part of where I look. And I think it doesn't even have to get super philosophical. I think about, say you're looking at, I don't know, fall of the Roman Empire, right? And every, ninth grade textbook is going to give you the 6 reasons why the Roman Empire fell. Well, what if you looked at it instead as what if you gave the students instead the chance to look at, possible candidate factors or data that might lead them to make these conclusions, let them discover that pattern themselves, argue for or against it, right? Let them be part of the creative part of that discipline, social studies, rather than just, gobbling up what someone else already made, right? I think that shift of letting students discover it, I think most every teacher is going to say, yeah, that's a good thing in my discipline, right? Instead of telling them the rules of what makes a sonnet, let them discover that, right? Let them argue for it. Let them look at ones that kind of bend the rules, and say, well, is it still a sonnet or not? And I think there's a lot of richness there, and certainly more rewarding activities.
I taught a first year writing class when I was getting my master's, and one of my favorite class periods that we had is one time we debated whether or not emojis could be considered punctuation. And students came out of the woodwork on that one. Once you start, what is punctuation? Oh my gosh, I don't know.
Yeah, and I'm going to contend that is a classic computer science argument, right? And in fact, it could really have, software design implications. When you think about the way symbols and stuff are encoded in the computer, right? There's organizations, international organizations behind the scenes that approve that the Unicode for the smiley face emoji is 00F, whatever those, and should it be in the same category as a punctuation? Those are real arguments that actually can really matter. And so getting a chance to play around with that approach in a lower stakes setting, that's good stuff.
Let's hear it. Your third strategy.
This one is a bit of a cheat because I'm not entirely sure if it's a fully distinct one, but I'm going to refer to the idea of algorithms, right? So again, an algorithm in computer science can be defined variously, but it's a set of instructions, right, that are clear enough that whatever machine or person is going to execute them, they can do it without ambiguity, right? It could be, get out the 2 pieces of bread, get out the knife, get out the peanut butter, get out the jam, right? It can include conditions. If you don't like jam, then put the jam back. You could say, you can have what we call iteration. While the driveway isn't free of snow, keep shoveling, right? So those simple building blocks are used to describe virtually everything that goes on at a computer, right, at one level or another. We take advantage of that abstraction I mentioned before, so that we don't have to perpetually, dig down to the lowest level of detail. Once I tell you how to shovel the sidewalk, you probably know how to shovel the driveway, right? And with a few modifications, I can tell you that. So, algorithms. As early as preschool, kids are taught procedures, classroom processes and routines, right? How to line up for recess, how to get ready for snack time, how to, and that goes on through, middle school and on up to high school, really through college, right? There's the process that you go through for signing up for classes. There's the process you go through for ordering your cap and gown. They're there everywhere. And I think one thing I propose is to recognize them and label them as algorithms from early on, so that you can then look at things like debugging. You know what? Whenever we get ready to go out to recess, we run into this problem. Let's look at our algorithm and see if we can debug that. And I think that's a valid framework. I think it's tied closely to an ability to communicate, both verbally and in written terms, right? Your goal as an essayist is to make your point cleanly, simply, and elegantly without ambiguity, right? I mean, if you're a fiction writer, you're looking for ambiguity, but right, when an employer talks about good communication skills, it's often this kind of thing. Can you describe your process, right? The act of describing your process, coders find early on, walking someone else through their code, oh, you know what? That doesn't do what I thought it did. That's where the problem is, right? And I think the same thing happens in debugging an essay, in looking at a math problem with a partner or, whoever, that forcing you to articulate in a step-by-step manner, to slow down, break it down, and look at it is a really important skill. So I think using the language and using that framework from early on is only a good thing.
Well, before we get going, there's 2 quick questions I want to ask you. The first one is, can you tell me about a student who touched your heart and changed the way you teach?
Yeah, of course there have been many. About midway through my face-to-face career, I was teaching AP Calc. It was first hour in the morning, just tough for high school juniors and seniors, and had some tardy problems. And one student in particular, man, just day after day, he'd drift in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes late, and wasn't always doing great on keeping up on work. And so I think one day I must have let my facial expressions just kind of get away from me. And another student in the class who I happened to actually know a little bit better, I'd had her in an earlier year, she stopped after class. She said, Mr. Santer, you may want to just talk to him to see about what's going on. I won't use his name, but you may just want to just talk to him, see if you can get him to share what's going on. Turns out he's one of 2 kids. He has a younger brother who is like 8. His dad had an opioid addiction. So most every night he was doing something to take care of his dad, and then making sure to, get his brother ready for school and walk him to school, because he lived, a bad neighborhood away from the elementary school where his brother could be dropped off early. And of course he didn't share this with me immediately. And of course, I was moved and was like, oh God, what can I do? And he said, do you think I could just call you sometimes? He says, I don't know if I can pass this class, but I just really want to learn as much as I can. And I'm like, at this point, I'm nearly in tears. And so when you asked early on about, the experience of transitioning, or what made me be a teacher or something like that. I mean, that moment was just huge for me. And I don't know if that it made me, more open and receptive to every tardy student afterwards, but it was a great reminder that there's so many stories out there, and you can't always know them, and if you're lucky, maybe you can get them to share a little bit.
Yeah, and just the reminder that even if it's not, even on that scale, that's obviously a pretty significant disruption in a student's life, but everybody has a story. And you can never remember that enough times, I feel. You have to keep circling back to it and remind yourself,
Yeah, I mean, and even just like selfishly, it's kind of horrifying. Like, what if I just been a jerk one day and really lit into him in front of, the rest of the class? He would have just sat there and taken it, because, like, in his world, just wasn't that big a deal, but I would have just felt so small.
All right. And can you tell me about a teacher who had an impact in your life?
I told you I come from a huge family, so in one sense, I've had a million teachers have an impact on me. One that I thought of was a high school math teacher I had long before I even thought about this, Mr. Cotner. And to start with, he was super cool. I mean, he was quiet about it. He wasn't, flashy or anything, but he just had a presence. He didn't get flapped by kids. He could talk real easily with you. But what I learned, only kind of in retrospect, why he stuck in my head, was he was the first teacher where I was really aware of how they planned out the moves they would make. How, seemingly spontaneous questions that he would put in, as a follow-up, or the way he built an explanation demonstrating how to understand something from 2 or 3 different directions. I mean, for the first time, I really got the sense of like the craft that went into it. And I didn't, couldn't articulate that as a 14-year-old, but looking back, I'm like, he really had game. I mean, he was really good at showing the reasons underneath something, and talking about multiple ways to get to the same right answer. Just a lot more flexibility and freedom and fluidity than I certainly experienced. This is a long time ago in education, where a math class would have been taught, for the most part, straight out of the book. This is the example. We'll do it on the overhead projector together. Then, you'll try one on your own, then you'll do the homework. Whereas Mr. Cotner was he would build a model, or you would have, a chalkboard explanation. He would have other avenues into understanding things. And it was really eye-opening to me in terms of technique. But the overriding thing underneath it was that he was cool. You could relate to him. You could talk to him. He knew you, right? I wouldn't ask a question because I was too cool to ask a question, but he would know, if maybe I was struggling with something, and would circle by my desk and check in on me, right? Just had a lot of stuff going on.
Do you think consciously or unconsciously that had an impact on the way that you teach?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, I think both, right? I think there are times, I can think of a couple of his, explanations, for, what makes a rhombus different from a square or something like that. I can picture him up at the front of the classroom doing that. So I have some of those conscious memories, but I suspect that the seemingly effortless way he made connections with students and built relationships is something that's influenced me. I can't claim his skill, but it's something to aspire to.
I recall when you were the teacher of the year, the online teacher of the year in 2019, I want to say. Is that right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. I remember reading a couple,
just little tidbits that came from whoever nominated you, and hearing stories about you relating to students. And that echoed kind of the one that you just said before about a student really opening up to you. So I think you probably got some Mr. Kottner. Is it Mr. Kottner?
It was Mr.
Some
Kottner,
Mr. Kottner
yep.
vibes going on too. So
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think we opened, with the rewarding moments, or almost opened with it. And it is what keeps you going, right? That you do get hints of that it mattered and that it made a difference. And, there's always that hope out there. And there's nothing better than that feeling.
Without a doubt, it's challenging work to get students to think deeply about their own thought processes and use concepts from the world of computing to better understand both the technology at their fingertips and their own minds. But with leaders like Kevin forging our path forward, if there's one thing we're certain of, it's that the future is bright. You know someone who's an inspiring Michigan educator who should be featured on our show? Send us an email at bright@michiganvirtual.org to let us know who they are and why we should interview them. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Bright, Stories of Hope and Innovation in Michigan Classrooms. This podcast is produced by Herbie Gaylord, is hosted by me, Nikki Herda, and is shaped by many of our passionate and talented colleagues. Big thanks to Cassie Harris, Krista Green, and Brandon Batista for their contributions to this episode. Bright is brought to you in part by Mimic Insurance Company, ensuring the educational community for more than 70 years. Teachers and school employees visit mimic.com/quote to see how much you can save. The Bright podcast is made possible by Michigan Virtual, a nonprofit organization that's leading and collaborating to build learning environments for tomorrow. Education is changing faster than ever. Discover new models and resources to move learning forward at your school at michiganvirtual.org.